Well, it's been about 4 weeks since we've been in 2 Timothy, and so it's needful for us to review what is 2 Timothy, what is Paul saying to Timothy is a bigger question. 2 Timothy is the last letter that Paul ever wrote. In fact, tradition has it that he was beheaded on the Ostian Way right outside of Rome shortly after he wrote this letter. It was his swan song. And so he realizes that he has to pass the baton. He has to turn things over to Timothy. He realizes, too, that Timothy is a young man. And while he said in Philippians that he has nobody else like Timothy, he realizes that Timothy has certain weaknesses. One thing, he had a proclivity towards fear, timidity. And so Paul begins to give what I call stepping stones to greatness, because he's essentially saying, Timothy, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take on these characteristics in light of your perhaps weaknesses or proclivities. This is what you need to do. And the first thing he said was to have this fearless authenticity. And then he said, don't quit. And then he said, be courageous. And then he said, persevere. And then he said, don't be ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And the last time that we were together, he basically said, Timothy, be a vessel, an instrument for noble use. Allow God to use you. He said in a big house, a large house, picturing the church, he said there are many different instruments. Some for noble use, some for ignoble use. He says, make your mind up that you plan to be a person who's used for noble purposes. Now, when we come to 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul points out that there are those who profess to know Christ, but who really are only going through the motions. Some, in fact, he implies are unbelievers, but there are also those who are believers who profess to know Christ, but they deny the power that they have resident in each of them. Those who don't know Christ, we would refer to as apostate. But I want to say to you this morning, I believe that there are two forms of apostasy. One is for the unbeliever. The unbeliever, the apostate of the unbeliever, is one who denies the deity of Christ, who Christ is. But I want to suggest to you today, based upon our text, that there is a denial of Christ in a different way. Some people would call it Christian apostasy. I've even heard some say that it's Christian atheism. That is that they profess to know Christ, they go through the motions, and perhaps they've come to a place where they've trusted Christ, but perhaps because life has become tough, they've kind of turned their back on living the Christian life, and so they don't walk away from God, but they have, as Paul said, a form of godliness, and yet they deny the power in them. They deny the power that enables them to deal with the evil around them. And that's really what Paul is talking about here in our passage today. He's not saying that they've lost their salvation, but they basically have kicked it into automatic pilot, as we often say, and they're coasting. But their lives really, essentially the implication is their lives are miserable. Remember what Billy Graham said, the most miserable person today in the world is not the unbeliever, it's the believer, the carnal believer who's out of fellowship with God. And I believe that Paul is encouraging Timothy as well as warning him, and I think warning us as well. Because you see, there is the seed of apostasy, Christian apostasy, in each of our lives. The temptation is to hide and to play the game. And so what Paul is saying to Timothy here, Timothy, be genuine, be real. Don't play the game. Don't go through the motions. Don't be, a professor without being a possessor. And then the question we would raise at this point is, what is it that can keep us from being genuine, being sincere, authentic, and real believers? Now understand, there is a game that's played in churches today. And the game is that we are all to be perfect. So we erect this facade, and we live behind this facade, and we come to church on Sunday, and we've got our Sunday best, and people ask us how we're doing, and we say, wonderful, wonderful, just wonderful, I'm bumping heaven. And we know that's not true. Some days we might be bumping heaven. One guy put it this way: some people act like they're always on top of the pile, and some people act like they're always under the pile. The reality is we go through life shoveling piles. That's the reality. You see, I'm of the opinion that a person who fully understands grace, they understand the cross and the benefit of the cross and the forgiveness that's taken place at the cross for each of us, is a person who is set free, as we were singing today. Why? Because he has been set free from this imprisonment of living in this, behind this facade, in this prison, in fact, to be less than perfect, but forgiven and in progress. Now, I think what Paul was saying here in this passage to Timothy is, Timothy, there are people out there who are going to push you and put pressure on you to hide behind the mask and to go through the motion. And there are some reasons, other reasons, in fact, as to why we do that. And he gives a litany of things that really describe the attitude and the behavior of someone who's living behind the mask. I want us to get into the passage and let's really see what are the answers that we need to have that will set us free to be real people. The first thing we want to look at is in verse 1, and that's the time of apostasy. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come." Now, the first question that comes up is, what is he talking about when he uses the phrase the last days? Well, the Jews always believed that the last days would be characterized by oppression, by an increase of sin, by difficulty, by stress, by distress, and we could go on and on and on. But when he used the phrase the last days, Paul is speaking of a specific time period. And in fact, in Acts chapter 2, we read that on the day of Pentecost, Peter quoted the prophecy of Joel. And basically he said the day of Pentecost is the partial fulfillment of the prophecy of Joel that will be completely fulfilled. And those who've been in my classes on prophecy, you will remember that there are times that there is a partial fulfillment and an ultimate fulfillment. That's true of the new covenant. In fact, with the church, and there's an ultimate fulfillment with the new covenant with Israel in the tribulation period. Well, Paul quoted Joel, who said that God would pour out his Spirit in the last days. So he says the day of Pentecost was the beginning of the fulfillment of the last days. In the first words of the book of Hebrews in chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, he says, "In many and various ways God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son." So what is he talking about? Paul is talking about a period of time that began on the day of Pentecost and that continues on. In fact, it's interesting that the word that's used here in terms of time is not the word that's most often used in the New Testament. Chronos, the word for which we get the word chronology, right? It's not the word that's used here. This is a different word that speaks of a season, a specific period of time. And so Paul says this is a specific period of time, and it has a specific time in terms of bookends. It has a beginning, it has an end. But it's also interesting that he says that he uses the word difficult here, which in the Greek carries the idea of that which is perilous and grievous. The Greek scholar and famous philosopher Plutarch used the term to describe an ugly, infected, dangerous wound. That was the description of this time. I don't think anybody would doubt today that we're in that period of time. It's a dangerous time, and it's becoming more difficult. But when we move to verse 2, we see the description of apostasy. Now, what he does here, he talks about basically what causes apostasy, in this case, Christian apostasy. And then he gives an attitude that really, everything else that follows, this attitude that he gives is foundational to that, everything that he's about to say. But the key verse in this section, verses 1 through 9, is verse 5. It's verse 5. And keep in mind, remember that Paul's not talking about people outside the church, but rather he's talking about those in the church. In fact, he makes a very striking statement in verse 5. Look in verse 5. It says, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power, avoid such men as these. Now, what's interesting here when he says holding to a form of godliness, he uses what's called a present participle, which means they continue to hold to this form of godliness. And then he says, and then in verse 5 also he says, although they have denied its power. So the idea here, that word denied their power, that phrase, it's a one word in the Greek, is what we call a perfect participle, which means they come to the point where they've denied the power and they continue to deny it, thus causing them to live from behind a facade, playing a game. In other words, at some point in time, they've decided, hey, this is not for me. This Christianity is too tough, too difficult, and so we're just going to, kick it into automatic pilot and coast living this way. It's a strong statement. It's a powerful statement. See, Paul basically proclaims that the primary cause of these repetitive cycles, and get this, the primary cause of these repetitive cycles of stress and danger is the hypocritical lives of Christians. Christians who outwardly look pious, who look committed, who look devoted, who look dedicated, but on the inside, it's all hollow. Folks, when the church is powerless, evil will reign. Immorality in the world is caused, now get this, immorality in the world is caused in part by the insincerity of Christians, primarily the church. Darkness among the nations is an outgrowth of ignorance and darkness in the church. It's a strong statement, strong indictment to the church. Because Paul is saying these are people who have a form without force, a religion without reality, a Christianity without Christ, a godliness without God. They are professors, but not possessors. I do not think that the church and believers today fully understand what the Bible has to say about the church and the power of the church in the world today. The New Testament seeks to convince us that the church is the most important body in the world. That's why we need to take the church seriously. In fact, God builds society, and get this, God builds society around what happens in the church. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, and if the church loses its salt, its flavor, if it becomes saltless," he says the church of the world, I should say, the world goes to pot. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world." If the light that's emanating from you is an illusion, the world is in trouble. The church in our world today, I'm concerned about the church in our world today because we've become so shallow, and it's all about feel good. And so when things don't go our way, we don't live out the life. My wife told me about this young lady in her class, one of her classes this semester or two ago. And the first thing she told her on day one was that she wanted to be in Christian ministry, that she was going into Christian ministry. You know who had the worst attitude in that class by the end of the semester? Guess what? My daughter went to work for a company down in Buckhead, and they have several salespeople there. And the first day when they had all these salespeople there was a young lady who said, "I'm a PK, I'm a preacher's, a pastor's daughter, pastor's kid," you say. And she began to talk about all the things she didn't do. My daughter said she was fired because she got in a fight with someone there. My daughter said the things that came out of her mouth would shame anyone. Paul's charge here to Timothy is that in these last days, do not allow the stress and the hypocrisy and the duplicity that's in the church to draw you in to play the game. There's a strong word, strong indictment here. Now, in this passage, he begins to talk about the very things that are a part of an attitude that will cause us to hide behind the mask. By the way, that's what the word hypocrisy means. You know that, don't you? It means, in the literal Greek, it means to act from behind the mask. You've seen the marquee for actors and theatrics. It's a mask, and someone's holding a mask, and they speak from behind the mask. That's what hypocrisy means. So here in verse 2, he begins to talk about the description of apostasy, Christian apostasy, if you will. In verse 2, he says, "For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money." Let's stop right there. For men will be lovers of self. There are two groupings here. And this first statement, to me, is the marquee, if you will. The Greeks were notorious for making a primary statement and then coming behind it and giving the substance of that statement. It's like if it used to be, you don't see this today, but it used to be years ago, when you went downtown to see the movies, and you saw on the marquee in giant letters, "Gone with the Wind." In smaller letters, you saw Clark Gable players. That's the idea. So I really think what Paul is doing here is he's giving the primary statement that causes people to live from behind a mask. What is it? Lovers of self. The center of gravity for the apostate, Christian apostate, is self-love. It's self-centered love. It's the basic sin of humanity. St. Francis of Assisi said this: self-love is cunning. It pushes and insinuates itself into everything while making us believe it is not there. Self-love is the most contemptible form of idolatry. You say, why? Because it replaces God on his throne in our lives. It replaces him with someone else. Who is that someone else? Self. And folks, we humans make bad gods. If I'm characterized by self-love, I will always believe that happiness comes in direct proportion to self-gratification. And I will do anything to get that self-gratification. Maria broke up with Jimmy. They've been broken up for about a year. And then Maria wrote Jimmy a note. Said this: "Jimmy, I miss you so badly. I think of you all day and all night long. You dominate my mind, and I just don't want to be apart from you anymore. Jimmy, let's reconnect." And then there was a P.S. "Congratulations on winning the lottery." It's amazing how we are willing to do most anything that will benefit us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul, in verse 15 of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, said, "And he died for all, so that they who live might no longer live for themselves." You get that? Might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. Did you get that? Those who come to Christ, Christ died for us in order that we might not live, what? Unto ourselves. What's that have to say about self-love? Now, what's interesting about this passage is that this passage really is on the heels of chapter 4. In chapter 4, where the Apostle Paul states, "We who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus, what? Might be made manifested in our mortal flesh." What was Paul saying there? Paul was saying, listen, when we come to Christ and when we declare him Lord of our lives at some point, God begins to schedule surgery in our lives. And why? Because he wants to bring to death that self-life, that self-centered life that's all about me and not about Christ. I find it really interesting that the Apostle Paul in Philippians said to the people, I hope to send Timothy to you so that he can encourage you. And then he says this, for I have no one else of kindred spirit who will genuinely be concerned for your welfare. Isn't that sad? Paul said, I don't have anybody else who will care enough about you to give their life and time to you. And folks, the church is no different today. When we need people who will give their lives to seeing people come to Christ, we're all about self. In fact, our churches nurture that. Many of our series, and don't get me wrong, there are series that we ought to do that have to do with felt need. But if you go out online and you read many of the series that are being done, it's all about self. Where's His glory? Where's the self-sacrifice life for Christ? Today we live in the me generation. The focus is on my rights, my needs, my views, the very things that will kill relationships, and especially our relationship with God. The first question we always ask is, what do I get out of it? Right? Listen, Christians point their fingers at unbelievers and they say, look how selfish they are. And here the Apostle Paul points his finger at the church and he says, look how selfish the church is. There's a little jingle that's been written that graphically illustrates this. It says, I had a little tea party this afternoon at 3. 'Twas very small, 3 guests in all, just I, myself, and me. Myself ate up the sandwiches, and I drank up the tea. 'Twas also I who ate the pie and passed the cake to me. It's the way that's the way the world lives their lives. But folks, we're not far behind the world. Now, what Paul does here, and if you're reading this passage, and you may, when Pete was reading it, you may have thought, there's a list of things here. And it's just kind of a litany of characteristics of someone or people. They're kind of ugly. But you have to understand this. To make sense of this passage, in my view, you have to understand that everything he's about to say here in this passage is the substance of a self-centered life. We're going to march through these fairly quickly. Some will camp on more than others, but understand this. This is what he's saying. Paul is saying, you want to understand what the self-life looks like? Self-centered life? And often we would say that, raise that question, would we not? If we were sitting in a Bible study with Paul and he said it's a self-centered life, and we would say, well, what's that look like? And here's what he says. The first thing he says is lovers of money. Someone has said, time will separate the best of friends, and so does money and marriage. We need to remember that Ephesus, where Timothy spent a big part of his time, kind of as a pastor, Ephesus was the place where a person could easily lose their soul. It was known as the treasure house of the ancient world. It was known as the Vanity Fair of Asia Minor. It was a modern-day Newport Beach, California, a Beverly Hills, California, or Manhattan, New York. It was a place, again, where you could lose your soul. Go back to chapter 6 of 1 Timothy. Let's go back to the book in front of 2 Timothy. In chapter 6, verse 10. And here Paul says, for the love of money, and apparently, again, that was a problem in this day, as it is today, I suspect. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. There was a Reverend Ike who was a heretical teacher a number of years ago, and he was really into the prosperity doctrine. And Reverend Ike said it's not the love of money that's the root of all evil, it's the lack of money that's the root of all evil. Sometimes we think that. Someone said the love of money is the root of all evil, except now it isn't around long enough for even a fleeting romance. Please note, he did not say that money is dangerous or evil. There are some Christians who poo-poo on anyone making any money. He's talking about the love of money. Sometimes in our pursuit of excellence, God blesses us financially. There's nothing wrong with that. I've said before, one of the most godly men I know is a multimillionaire in Newport Beach, California. He said, God, if you'll bless my construction company, he said, I'll give 1 day a week to the church. And they have an office in the church for him to do his work 1 day a week. A person is a lover of money when family, friends, conscience, time, and personal growth are sacrificed to achieve it. Someone said money is a good servant, but a terrible master. Someone else said too many of us are spending money we haven't earned to buy things we don't need to impress people we don't like. Here's the thing. There's nothing wrong with money as long as you keep it in proper perspective. But when it becomes, and here's where you get the principle of and the idea of hiding behind the mask. So many people pursue success and status not to be for the glory of God and to have an impact in the world for good, but so that others will look at them and say, boy, man, look at me. Look what I've achieved. Look who I am. And that's a love for money. As someone has said, I've never seen a U-Haul trailer behind a hearse. You can't take it with you. My dad used to say at times when we would get uptight about money, and we never had much money, but my dad would say, hey, and he was never frugal. Never frivolous with his money. He was quite frugal. Had to be when you had 4 boys. He said, it's just money. It's just money. And what was he saying? He was saying it's not who we are. It's not who we are. It's not what makes us who we are. The next thing is boastful. Alazon is a word, and this word is more than pride, though it includes pride. It's an old Greek word coming out of the old classical Greek language, which means one who pretends to be more than he really is. It's used of a wandering quack or a quack doctor. It means empty pretender. Plato said, it is a person who claims greatness that he does not have. Again, you can see this idea of someone acting from behind a mask in the word. It's certainly inherent in the word, implicit in the word. In Newport Beach, I served as an intern in a church in Newport Beach, California, right after seminary. One of the most wealthy places in our nation. Time magazine ran an article said there are more corporate heads living in Newport Beach than in anywhere else in the nation, including Manhattan. One of the things I discovered in Newport Beach was that there were people who were driving cars that they couldn't afford, people who were living in $1 million homes and $1.5 million homes, and they had nothing to put in them to put over the windows. Why? Because of status, of boasting, trying to be something they're not. That's the idea behind this word. The next word is arrogant. And this has a literal meaning of placing above, thus having a superiority attitude. This is one who has a secret contempt for others. They regard themselves as above others. You say, well, what does that look like in the church today? I'll tell you what it looks like in the church today. It's those who look down their nose at other people who perhaps have blown it spiritually and emotionally and whatever, and morally. And they look down their nose and they treat them with contempt rather than treating them in grace and forgiveness and love and acceptance. They ignore the beam in their own eye, the beam of self-righteousness, as they judge others. And if we look closely in Proverbs chapter 6, where it talks about the sins that God hates, the first one that's mentioned is pride. The next one, it says disobedient to parents, and this obviously shows that apostasy has reached the family. And then it says ungrateful. You see, when we are about ourselves, it's always about give me here and a give me there, here, give me there, give me everywhere, give me. And we can't get enough. I watched a podcast last week of actually as a football coach speaking at Adrian Rogers' former church. And he started to tell a story about himself, and he prefaced the story with saying this. He said, we're all one step away from stupid. And then he began to tell the story about the day he came home. He has a wife and 3 daughters. He began to say to his wife, or to lament, I should say, about how disorganized the house was. Not a wise thing to do. He got on the phone and called his mentor and said, that one step away from stupid? Yeah. He said, I stepped over it today. His mentor said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back and tell your wife, they had 3 daughters. He says, I want you to tell your wife that you'll do the washing for one of the daughters. You'll do the loading, you'll load the washer, and then when you do that, you'll see God will change your heart. And he said when he began to do that and he took out the clothes, he began to thank God for the arms that filled that blouse, for the legs that went through the pants. And he said, it changed my attitude completely. You see the difference between being grateful? It's not about me. It's about him. The next thing is unholy, and this really is one who doesn't have the basic decencies of life. Now, when you get to verse 3, and we've got to pick up the pace here. You get to verse 3, you see the actions and attitude, the actions, I should say, that grow out of this attitude of self-love. Let me just walk through them. First is unloving. And again, Paul is answering a question, basically. The question is, okay, if these things, if the things he just described are attitudes of self-love, what about behavior that might grow out of that self-love? First is unloving. This is without the natural affection. It's devoid of love and affection. Irreconcilable. This is one who becomes involved in a cold war in relationships. Certainly in marriage, but what Paul is talking about here is in the church. And here's something. One of the things I do not understand, well, I shouldn't say I don't understand. I do understand. But sometimes I have a difficulty understanding why believers will cherish an offense and be bitter for years. I mean, psychologically, I understand. I can clinically explain to you why people do that, okay? But biblically, when you understand the cross, it's still about self-preservation. And what is that? That's self-love, right? In fact, this fall I'm going to do a series on forgiveness. I feel God has really impressed upon me that that's a series that we need to do. That not necessarily that I'm not thinking about anybody, but it's something that every believer needs to understand, to fully understand God's grace. Next thing is malicious gossip. Interesting, the Greek word is the word diabolos. That tell you anything? It's a word for the devil, if you didn't know that. It means accuser. John MacArthur said this. He says, gossip is often thought of as being relatively harmless, but at best it is unkind, harmful, and ungodly. Malicious gossip is a sin of an even more evil and destructive sort. Whereas the irreconcilable person tends to disregard and neglect others, malicious gossips make a point of harming others. Now watch this, and I want you to see how this is about self. Whether to promote their own interest, to express jealousy or hatred, or simply to vent their anger, they take perverse pleasure in damaging reputations and destroying lives. Where does that come from? From self-love, right? Next one is without self-control. This is a person who's out of control. Next one is brutal. And let me just, if you want to connect a word for that, brutal simply means mean. Mean. Haters of good. Some people will say, well, this can't be believers. Believers don't hate good. When district superintendent said to me in the Evangelical Free Church, a good friend of mine, he's after having negotiated several conflicts in different churches, he said, Byron, Christians can be so mean. It breaks your heart. Conceited. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, as we move into verse 6 and 7, we see the work of apostates. Let's just read this. But the godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought, well, I'm in the wrong chapter. Let's go back to chapter, in the wrong book, actually. Just seeing if you were awake. For among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, I want to share something with you here. It talks about weak women who are weighed down with sin. Not saying all women are weak. It's saying that these women are susceptible. Now, catch a hold of this. Why would they be susceptible? Here's why. Here's a revelation. When grace is not practiced in the church, and when people are pressured to hide behind a mask, then where can people go to find grace and healing and forgiveness? Nowhere. And so they become susceptible to cults. That's what this is talking about. Now, you see the work, the leaders of apostates in the last two verses of our section here, verses 8 and 9. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also opposed the truth, men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to the faith, but they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes and Jambres' folly was also. When Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh. There were some magicians there. In the Old Testament, we don't learn their names. We learn their names in this passage here. We know that Aaron threw down his rod, and it turned into a snake. And the magicians threw down their rod that supposedly turned into a snake, except they did it by sleight of hand. We all know what happened at that point. Aaron's rod ate the snakes. His snake ate their snakes. Now, I think there are a couple of lessons that come out of this. One, in any heretical teaching, there will be a great degree of pretense. A great degree of pretense. Those snakes they threw down were, while they were real snakes, they could not match the power of God. And secondly, what Paul was saying to Timothy in this passage, he was saying, Timothy, don't panic. Evil has its limits. God's power is always greater than Satan's. Satan always overreaches. Now, what's the application? Let me give you two. Do not fear Satan or people. God's power sets you free to stand for Christ. You say, Byron, my life's a mess. I don't know how I can stand for Christ. My life is not where God wants me to be, so what? Folks, we're all damaged goods. It's His grace that sets us free, not perfection. Secondly, do not fear judgment or criticism. God's grace sets you free to be genuine. To be genuine. Not to be perfect, but to be genuine. Paul was saying to Timothy, be real. Don't cave into the pressures to live from behind the mask. And he would say that to us today.